Friends, we are a little more than halfway through March, Women's History Month, whose purpose is to increase our consciousness and knowledge about women's history, to take 1 month of the year to remember the contributions of notable and ordinary women in hopes that there will come a day when it will be impossible to teach history without remembering the contribution and sacrifices of great women against all odds. We're also entering the near halfway mark through the Torah in our annual reading cycle as we look forward to the third book of the Torah, Leviticus, when this Shabbat ends. But first, the book of Exodus comes to an end with this week's Vayakel Pekudei, Exodus chapters 35 through 40. And despite the fact that this book, Exodus, Shemot, takes its name from the Exodus from Egypt, leaving Egypt is not the most important thing that happens in this book if you want to measure it by the sheer amount of ink that the ancient scribes used in writing this book of Exodus. The most important thing that happens in Exodus is that our ancestors received the blueprint for the tabernacle, the Mishkan, carrying the 10 Commandments, and then they build it. And the book ends with a list, a record of all the precious metals that were used in its construction, leading to the construction of synagogues like ours and all the materials it took to build. The book ends with details of the priestly garments that were made, which are remembered by the way we dress the Torah we're looking at, with bells and adornments. And finally, we read that God's presence filled the tabernacle, and only when the cloud of God's presence lifted could and would the Israelites continue on their journeys. And only here, not at home, but only here in this synagogue model of the tabernacle, in this Danziger chapel, can you literally see this week's Torah portion depiction in front of you on the tapestry you're facing, recalling the fire and God's cloud, the visible sign of God's presence in nature, descending upon the tabernacle, the ark, as a signal for our ancestors, the people of Israel, to move forward on their journey through the wilderness. The big idea here is that God is not stationary, sitting on a throne in heaven, as some of us were told as kids. God wanders with the Jewish people. And it is this idea that has sustained our people through centuries of exile. Wherever Jews have gone, wherever Jews have lived, no matter what, God has been in exile with us. Yes, God single-handedly created the world, but God gave Moses and other human beings like you and me the task of building the tabernacle and synagogues like this one as a visible reminder of God's presence in our lives and as an inspiration for our people. God shrinks in order to make room for the world to exist and for us to build places of goodness for us to live our lives and to make whole that which is broken, to improve and perfect an imperfect society, a society which is man's doing, not God's. And how fitting that this big idea falls almost right smack in the middle of Women's History Month. I've noted before that when Temple's first female president, Mildred Schwartz of blessed memory, when she was born in 1918, women were not even allowed to vote in America. Now, how far we've come at Temple too, with numerous presidents of the synagogue, women, and in fact, with Temple's immediate past president, current president, and future president, all women, thank God. As we look forward to upcoming Temple girls reading from the Torah and becoming Benot Mitzvah, let's remember that our 4,000-year-old tradition, wisdom literature, promoting the idea of equality, it still took thousands of years for girls to have the same privilege that boys do, reading from the Torah. The first time a girl, in case you didn't know, was allowed to publicly read from the Torah as a bat mitzvah wasn't until the 1920s, around the time women could vote in this country. Generations of American Jews today, ask any of our youth, they just assume women can become rabbis and cantors. But it wasn't until my good friend and colleague Sally Prezand was ordained by the Hebrew Union College in 1972 that you would ever see or hear women on the bima. And yet another unknown fact in the history of Judaism is that the Reform Jewish ceremony, when a Jewish teen officially becomes a young adult, it's called confirmation. That's what confirmation is. When a Jewish teen becomes a young adult. It's the first ceremony in all of Jewish history when girls participated equally with boys on the same bima. Women's History Month is necessary in all segments of society, including the religious world, where too many men misuse the Bible to demean, degrade, devalue women. Elected officials in high office who believe God is on their side have claimed, believe it or not, that moms who work outside the home stunt the emotional growth of their children. That's a direct quote from an elected official. Forget about how wrong it is to deny moms the same choices that fathers do. The facts are that 30% of families with children today are led by a single parent. 30%. And 85% of those families are led by a woman, usually Black, Hispanic, or another racial minority, without any money for child support in this country. It's not just that women earn 30% less than men for the same work. People don't talk about the fact that poverty hits women the hardest. Given that fact, not your opinion or politics or comfort or economic wherewithal, given that fact, how can a religious person not be focused on this issue? We need Women's History Month in the face of a single-minded concern with the unborn, which could refer to anything from an embryo to a fetus and equates personhood to an embryo, even criminalizing women who must terminate their pregnancies for health reasons as criminalized as murder. There's a bill in South Carolina proposing the death penalty for women who have to terminate their pregnancies, with no concern whatsoever over the devastating toll done to women forced to give birth against their will throughout history. The notion that the rights of grown women to make choices about their bodies means less than the right of the fetus. It's at odds with every stream and legal teaching of Judaism. I've preached on this ad nauseum for 30 years. But as one woman told me, I can't believe we still have to fight these same issues. It bears repeating because states and zealous religious extremists are still at it on this issue. No matter what news silo you read, Jewish law does not support government getting between a woman and the most personal and painful decisions she must make, especially when the culprit is another man, not a woman. When girls and women are empowered to become whoever and whatever they wish to be, we move closer to the kind of world Shabbat calls for. Speaking of the world, while everyone knows about the genocide in Rwanda almost 30 years ago now, can you believe it? 1994, when nearly 1 million Tutsi citizens were slaughtered by the dominant Hutu group. Less known is what happened after 1994. The Rwandan people realized that the ones who were raping and killing and lopping off other people's heads with machetes were virtually all men. So in reconstructing their nation after 1994, the people of Rwanda stipulated that women must constitute half the candidates on the ballot for every government position dealing with justice or education. And guess what the result was? People don't talk about. Rwanda became the democracy in the world with the highest female representation of all, 56.3%, even more than Sweden. And as a result, it's not just about fighting for women's rights. What's the result? The fear and genocide associated with Rwanda has receded. Empowering girls and women helped men equally, if not more. It's an issue that transcends gender for the betterment of all humanity. As we close the book of Exodus, we go from the heights of Mount Sinai to areas, as Rabbi Rona Shapiro teaches, to areas where women have excelled even when they were marginalized. We close the book of Exodus reading about interior design and fashion and the radical notion that we humans can build this house for God, a place where the Shekhinah, that's the female indwelling of God, Shekhinah, can live wherever we go. Did you ever build a house? Rabbi Shapiro asks. If so, you probably began with a vision of a certain kind of place, a feeling and a hope, maybe even a floor plan. But the actual building of the house ends up being an entirely different process. You have to pick faucets, doorknobs, molding strips, window frames overtake the initial vision. There's simply no way to build a house without the tiniest of details. And throughout history and in many places to this day, sadly, it's the women who were pushed to the margins outside the public sphere who made those details happen. In previous centuries, and yes, in the Jewish world too, men had multiple wives and often left women and children. And even if the men stayed married, it wasn't the men who raised the children. It was more often than not the women who kept everything together, raised the kids, cooked the meals, managed the farm or the house, including this house of God. Our synagogue dwells. God dwells, not just in the heavens. God dwells in the challah we're going to eat tonight. God dwells in the curtains we hang, in the good things we do at home. God dwells in the way we interact, the words we speak, our attention to the details. And in closing, if we work at it, these closing words of Exodus are saying, you and I will find that God doesn't just reside on Mount Sinai. God resides in our houses, in our reach, in our hearts, and in our midst. God dwells in more than the clouds. God dwells wherever and whenever we let God in. And let us say,